Are these massive quakes a precursor? Is something bigger coming for New Zealand or even Australia? Something stirred deep beneath the seafloor today, and not only once, twice. So on April 29th in 2025, two powerful earthquakes struck within less than 2 hours of each other, guys. And along one of the most volatile fault systems on the entire planet. It's the boundary between the Australian and the Pacific tectonic plates. And the first earthquake, that was a magnitude 6.2, struck near Bluff at the southern tip of New Zealand's South Island. So that's roughly 10 kilometers beneath the surface. The earth ruptured. And then just 97 minutes later, a magnitude 6.8 earthquake erupted farther south near the remote Macquarie Island in the Southern Ocean. Two shallow earthquakes, guys, two massive releases of energy, but only one tectonic system. And here's the question that seismologists and geologists are now urgently asking. Are these just isolated events, or are they the opening tremors of something much bigger? So let's have a closer look at that. So this area is a tectonic pressure cooker. The region where these earthquakes struck is no stranger to seismic violence. We really have to say violence. The Australian and the Pacific plates meet in a very complex dance of grinding, subducting, and sharing. So it's a slow motion battle that builds up tension over decades until something gives way. Near Macquarie Island, the tectonic activity is focused along the Macquarie Ridge complex. That's how it's called. And this is basically a long, jagged fault zone on the seafloor, underwater. It's an oceanic transform fault. And I said it in my last video, wait for my upcoming video. They have a new technology to measure what's going on with these fault lines, especially the hidden ones, in real time, up to the width of a hair. They can measure what's going on. So subscribe that you are going to be notified when I release that video. So this is an oceanic transform fault. So the two plates are scraping past each other horizontally. But unlike the San Andreas Fault in California, because that comes to mind when we hear that, the Macquarie Ridge has little to no human observation. We can't see it. We can see the San Andreas Fault, and it's highly observed. This Macquarie Ridge is very remote, under miles of water, and it's dangerously quiet until it is not. And then it comes basically as a surprise. And then north of there, closer to Bluff, the story shifts. This is the Alpine Fault that is basically slicing up New Zealand, New Zealand's South Island. And then we have the Precursor Trench. This is just offshore, and it marks where the Australian plate is diving beneath the Pacific plate. So a subduction zone as well. So they have it all. And this subduction zone, guys, is a bad one. It's capable of generating megathrust earthquakes, like the Cascadia Fault on the west coast of the US and Canada, for example, or in Japan. And it can do something similar to what we have already seen in Japan or Sumatra. So what we really need to understand, these fault lines, they're not random dots on the map, they're really pressure points. And they're really linked parts of a tectonic beast. That's what you can call it. It's really, really powerful. So what do we know about today's quakes? So the first event near Bluff, magnitude 6.2, reported at a depth of 10 kilometers. But there's a key detail that we need to look at. That depth may just be a default placeholder. They always put it at 10 kilometers. It might be way more shallow. because early readings often assign like 10 kilometers when the precise depth can't yet be determined. But it's shallow enough to produce significant surface shaking. The second quake, 6.8 near Macquarie Island, was recorded at only 4 kilometers depth. That's extremely shallow, especially for a strike slip event, right? A strike slip event. They're grinding until they're locked, and then they strike and slip. And it's under the ocean floor. So very, very shallow. And that could mean that the fault actually did rupture very close to the seafloor. And that is raising concerns, not just about the shaking, but about submarine landslides, for example, that could generate tsunami. So there is definitely a tsunami risk that could come with this. And both quakes occurred in a cluster pattern. That's what seismologists call that, like two large earthquake in quick succession along the same tectonic system. So this is a classic setup that raises absolutely the red flag for a potential triggered sequence. So could this be a precursor? That's the big question. Usually in tectonically active regions like this, stress doesn't just vanish after an earthquake. It moves. It redistributes. So when one segment of a fault ruptures, it can increase stress on adjacent segments, bringing them closer to failure. We know from the San Andreas fault, it's different segments, and now the southern segment is locked and loaded. Same with the Cascadia fault. It doesn't have to rupture full length. There's a northern part, there's a middle part around Oregon, Portland, and then there's especially the northern part in British Columbia, Canada, where experts say this one will rupture first. And then there's the southern part, like Northern California and Southern Oregon. So they could have a trigger effect, bringing them closer to failure if one ruptures. So this kind of stress transfer has already been documented in major quakes before. This is not just a theory, guys. So that's why we really need to be careful and have a closer look at that. Because if we look at the year 2004, there was a magnitude 8.1 earthquake near Sumatra that preceded this infamous magnitude 9.1. You would think 8.1, that's big enough, right? But then 9.1, this was this disaster that caused that devastating tsunami disaster. We all have that still in our minds. And then let's look at New Zealand. The Kaikoura earthquake in 2016. More than 20 faults ruptured in a chain reaction, starting with moderate shocks and ending in a complex, powerful sequence. So we should not be lured into safety saying the shock was big enough to be the main shock. Because again, Sumatra 8.1 followed by 9.1. So could these events today be foreshocks? Foreshocks in a way that signal a bigger earthquake is imminent? Well, the answer is difficult. The answer is possibly. But here's the truth. We don't know yet. Hopefully, science will progress further. So most clusters like this do not lead to a larger quake. In fact, statistically speaking, the most likely outcome is that the largest earthquake has already happened, hopefully. But still, there's a reason that agencies like GNS Science in New Zealand and the USGS in the US are watching this region very, very closely. When two shallow, large earthquakes strike near the same plate boundary in quick succession, this is something you should not and never ignore. Because especially in that region, they have lessons from the past. In 1989, a magnitude 8.2 quake struck south of Macquarie Island. And this was one of the largest ever recorded earthquakes in that area. And it came seemingly absolutely without warning, as a surprise. And it also didn't follow a typical pattern of foreshocks, which made it even more difficult. But sometimes patterns do emerge, but unfortunately only in hindsight. What we've learned from modern seismology is that the absence of immediate damage doesn't mean that the story is over. So far, there is absence of immediate damage, thankfully. Large earthquakes can trigger slips hundreds of miles away. They can even wake up faults that have been quiet for centuries. Of course, because it's rumbling and it's building up tension underground. But we definitely can say what today's earthquakes are revealing for us is that the system is loaded. Some tension has been released in one place, but we don't know yet how the surrounding faults are reacting. And the depth matters. Shallow quakes are dangerous, not because they shake the surface harder, do more damage, people feel it stronger, but because they're often signs of a new rupture or surface breaking slip. So both of today's earthquakes were shallow. For us, that means, guys, the energy had little distance to travel before it hit land or the ocean floor. And when shallow earthquakes cluster in a stressed system like the Macquarie Ridge and the Pysagor Trench, every seismologist immediately starts to pay attention. And we do that too. So what is the conclusion that we can draw from this as of right now? Is a bigger earthquake coming? Still, maybe. These could be the early rumbles of a much larger rupture or just a pair of powerful self-contained events. But the truth is, earthquakes do not follow a pattern or a script. But what we do know is this. The Australian Pacific plate boundary is one of the most seismically active faults on Earth. And today's earthquakes were shallow with a narrow time frame and along linked and locked and loaded fault zones. And historically, this region has produced very large earthquakes, some with very little to no warning. So this is definitely a moment to remain alert, to monitor, to prepare, but not to panic. Prepare. And there's more rumbling. One of New Zealand's currently most active volcanoes, Wakari, or known as White Island, still remains at alert level 3, indicating increased activity as well. That just on a side note. They have measured increased gas emissions, and there were really big concerns that this activity could escalate further. White Island is just a little bit off of New Zealand's North Island and the Bay of Plenty, which was spared by the earthquakes, by today's earthquakes. But a magnitude 3.1 tremor occurred just yesterday in that area. But the epicenter was not shallow like the ones that we've seen today. It was very deep, actually, at a depth of 217 kilometers. So that is probably not connected, but I thought it's interesting for you to know about that. And if you look at the map here with these New Zealand fault zones, basically they start in the northern Kermadec Islands and they're extending along the archipelago to the southern Macquarie Islands. And aside from the 6.8 and the 6.2, there were more earthquakes that they detected. So along the two main islands, there were 5 quakes with magnitudes 3 point something. And then in the region of the Kermadec Islands, that's just a little bit north of New Zealand, there were 2 more quakes with magnitudes 5.4 and 5.1. So it really looks like a jolt has gone through New Zealand's main fault zone, which is changing character several times along its course. But there's definitely no doubt it marks the plate boundary between the Indo-Australian and Pacific plates. And again, also, we're talking about this a lot just recently. These faults are part of the Pacific Ring of Fire. And I have made a video about this, that the Pacific Ring of Fire is unusually active right now with volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. You should check that video in the end screen, because the Pacific Ring of Fire and these faults are part of a system where most of the world's volcanoes are located, and also the big earthquakes are happening there. So check out the videos in the end screen. If you're new here, subscribe. And of course, don't forget to like the video and share it with as many people as possible to support this channel. And if you want to support the channel further, check out the links in the description. I have a Buy Me a Coffee site, buymeacoffee.com/silky. And thanks for the supers you're giving me here on YouTube. And if you'd like to support the channel with a monthly membership, you're also getting some behind the scenes videos for members only, about my private life and my animals, my farm, and what I'm doing. So click the join button, but the links are all in the description of this video. And be prepared. If you're living in New Zealand, let us know. Did you feel anything? What are your thoughts? Are you scared? What is everyone thinking there? I'd be very interested in that. So stay safe. I see you soon, guys. Bye-bye.